My name's Erik Erskine. I'm a web developer and I live in Brighton. I work as a freelance developer and use Drupal for most projects. One thing I'm not is an expert in Composer. So I, like a lot of people, kind of found a lot of the changes that have been introduced recently a little bit hard to get my head around, and I found that I was Googling for stuff and finding questions, answers on Stack Overflow and comments on Drupal that were a little bit out of date, and finding that things were changing very rapidly. And the things I was having to do to get sites working with Composer, it always felt like a bit of a barrier just to kind of get something done. So I ended up kind of having a look into it a bit more, and hopefully I can share something today that will help you if you do find that some of this is a little bit confusing. Composer is a tool for managing dependencies in PHP projects. It will, just a kind of quick overview, if I am writing a library, if I'm supplying a piece of code to somebody else to use, I can put my, I can just declare the other things that I need in a text file. That's quite nice, just to be able to say, oh, I need this and that, and not have to worry about shipping source code. For people collating those things into an application, they can use a command line tool just to go and get everything in one go and have all those dependencies managed for them. But Composer is very much a kind of developer-focused tool. We've been talking about PHP and source code and things like that. And the Drupal community is very broad and covers everything from individuals who just download an archive and put it on a web server, don't use any kind of version control, don't think about source code, right through to the big enterprise level organizations that have support and can afford to put investment into build processes and version control and dependency management. So there's this little bit of tension in the community about kind of, okay, we need to introduce this tool because it's very useful, but at the same time it can be hard for new people to get their head around. So I just want to, I don't have too many solutions to say, do it this way. I'm hoping to give you a little bit of context now about kind of how Composer works with Drupal, how it sort of fits in, but not perfectly. So at least you're a bit more aware of the issues surrounding it. A quick sort of overview of how you use Composer. First thing is to define requirements. In this case, I want to use a library that I found that handles kind of geolocation, and it provides classes to help with that. So I set up this text file which I can put one line in to say use version 2.0 or above of this particular geo library. What I've done there is to say it starts with version 2 and any version above that which is backwards compatible. Composer lets you set up these patterns for setting up your requirements, where you can say I want an exact version, or I want all version 2.0s, or a minimum or maximum. I could have done that last thing just on the command line, just by typing in Composer require and then putting in my thing. I could even have left off the version number altogether and let Composer figure out the most suitable one for me, which is usually the most recent stable version. So that's the first step. The second step we do is update. We want to have predictable code base, so we need to make sure if I'm sharing this with a colleague, I want to make sure that they have exactly the same version as I have. And in the last slide, we just said, get me the latest stable 2.0 version, which isn't really enough. So when I run Composer update, what it will do is go and look up that library, find what it needs, what the latest stable version is, and it will create this lock file. If we have a look at the lock file, it's similar to the original JSON file, but this is generated for me. It has the precise versions in there. So in this case, version 2.01. It's also found a couple of other dependencies on that library depended on itself, and it's gone and fetched those versions. So I didn't need to mention these bottom two. And this lock file, you would generally put that into version control. You would commit that, because then you can share it with a colleague on the same project, and they will get these same versions. They'll have exactly the same code base as you. That 2.0.1 is what Composer decided was the best version for me to have, given the pattern that I gave it. When there's an update, when 2.0.2 comes out, we can run this Composer update process again and get a new log file, and it will be reflected there. The third thing we want to do is to actually get these libraries downloaded, and that's quite a simple task. Just run Composer install. If you have a lock file, you can run install, and it will get those exact versions. It will put them all into this directory called vendor. And a question that comes up is, should you put this directory into version control? If you're writing a library that will be used by somebody else, then no, you don't put it in there, because you want them to be able to decide effectively which kind of version they have, and they'll have their own dependencies to go with it. If you're thinking of an application, there's sort of like there's a kind of top level of project that you know isn't going to be used as part of a bigger project, then the question is sort of maybe you can put it into version control if you want, but you don't have to. The sort of arguments against it are that it's cleaner just to put a text file that says version 123, and then your history will say, actually I've upgraded some component from 123 to 124, and that's just a single text file, a single diff, and actually we can go and, if we ever need to cross-reference that with the actual changes in that library, we can go and do that. Arguments for putting it into version control would say that actually if you don't, then you introduce another requirement to have Composer available and to be able to access Composer when you come to build your project. That may be an issue. Interestingly, it came up on the Drupal.org issue queue that somebody was saying that they were trying to build a project in China, and GitHub or something wasn't easily accessible, so they ran Composer install and it just didn't really work, and it took them an hour or something. So there are kind of interesting cases where you may want to have your source code in there. Another one that comes up is that some hosting environments, or what happens is people have started to use Git for deployment. Now, Git isn't a tool for deployment; it's for managing source code and tracking changes. But it ended up being quite convenient for people just to put all the source code into a repository and pull that repository down onto a server or push it onto a server. And some of the Drupal hosting platforms like Pantheon and Platform and Acquia work that way. You push a repository to them and it all just appears on the server. If you don't put the vendor directory in version control, you then have to figure out how you're going to get it on the server. Ideally, you'd have some kind of build process that takes a set of source code and provides you with a complete set of files that need to go on the server. Sometimes people will run that on the server themselves, which is maybe not ideal, but the principle is the same. You're kind of creating this build artifacts that you then deploy somewhere. Drupal itself uses Composer. If you go and download the tar file, you will find that there is a Composer JSON and a lock file and a vendor directory. You get all that for you. So if that's the case, then why is this tricky? Here's quite a common use case that people find, is that actually you go and go to drupal.org and you follow a few links and you end up with this page to say download it and install it, and that's fine. We then go and find some contributed modules and themes, we download those and we put them into the right place in the file system. And we might use Drush to kind of automate that, but essentially it's the same. We're just taking an archive and dropping it on. But there's some modules that we can't really do this for. This is part of Drupal Commerce, and it's called the address module. And this module uses a third-party library to handle international address formats. That library has nothing to do with Drupal at all, and it's available on Composer. But crucially, it's not shipped as part of the Drupal module for address, so we have to install it via Composer. And then things start to go a little awry because we saw that Drupal provided this Composer JSON file before, but should we really be editing that? It's not really ours to change, and it kind of feels like we're sort of hacking the core files a bit to do this. So we kind of go back to the drawing board a bit and start digging around a little bit further, and we end up with the Drupal documentation, which says actually we need to kind of now think about using Composer right at the beginning. And it says there are two templates that can be used to generate your new Drupal site via Composer. I can either use Drupal Composer / DrupalProject, or I can use Drupal / Drupal. And this is really a bit difficult for new people to get their head around, and there's not a definitive way of doing it. Probably the easiest way to kind of explain how these things work is the top one, Drupal / Drupal. That is the same as if you got the tar file. You get Drupal's own Composer JSON and lock files, and you can then run Composer install and you'll get the vendor directory. But that Composer JSON file is kind of owned by Drupal, and if you make a change from it, you're essentially making a fork. The second one is a slightly newer project that's come up, which is aimed to be a very small project, just with a dependency on Drupal core, that you would essentially, it's okay to fork the small project, and you don't need to change Drupal core. The first one I mentioned, actually, this composer, we can add things into it, and we will kind of create a composer JSON file, but we have to be really careful with updates. So sometimes if we just do drush update, it will download a whole load of new files, and it will download the new, if we're going, say, from 833 to 834, if we had a modified composer JSON, then we might find that once we get 834, that comes with a different composer file, which then overwrites our changes. And it also leads, the lock file can also be a problem, because that has a lot of things in it, and it can get quite messy. This is an issue that I kind of found out, that you're merging in a whole load of stuff that you did with a whole load of stuff that happened upstream with Drupal, and you get all these kind of nasty merge conflicts and things. So the second approach that we looked at, the Drupal template, that kind of goes down a different road of saying, well, actually, I just want to I don't want to download anything to begin with. I just literally want to start with an empty composer file, and then say, right, now here I want Drupal 8.3, and I want these contrib modules and these themes. And the composer JSON file, I kind of think of it as being something that you own, as opposed to something that Drupal owns. So it is really, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it, is that you say, these are the things I need. This is the project that's currently hosted on GitHub. The first bit, drupal-composer, that's there's a working group that is kind of doing some sort of unofficial integration with Composer and Drupal, and the Drupal-project is the name of the repository that they have, and it's a small template that really just has this Composer JSON that depends on the latest version of Drupal. It has a few other things as well, like it will bring in the console, and it will bring in drush, and it will bring in some stuff to do testing and things like that. The instructions tell you to do this, which there's quite a lot to get your head around there, so we'll go through it bit by bit. First of all, the create project, all that's doing is a clone of the repository and then running Composer update and Composer install. So the repository didn't have a lock file. We download it, we run update to create a lock file, and then we run install to build the vendor directory. As well as doing the vendor directory, it also has some special logic to say Drupal core goes in a directory called core, and the contrib modules go in modules, and themes as well. So this is the name of the template itself. So we're not actually downloading Drupal at this stage until we run, or until it runs Composer install for us. It's just getting this small template, and the dev there, the 8.x dev, and the stability dev is referring to the version of the template rather than the version of Drupal. We can go into that Composer JSON, and we can say I want 8.3.4, I think is the latest one. So that will give us a whole load of files in a directory. The main difference being that it has a web directory where you would put your document root. The reason for doing that is so that we can start to move, we want to start to move as much of the PHP code out of the document root as possible. It also allows Composer to kind of manage that whole web directory. So you can really think of everything under there as being stuff that's handled by Composer. It does a couple of extra things as well that where it doesn't really fit. So we've got these various odd files like index.php and the robots and htaccess. They kind of sit in the top level. They're not very big, and they're not really part of the library. They're not part of Drupal core because they don't go in the core directory. And Composer can't really handle that very easily. So we have this extra kind of add-on called Drupal scaffold, which will essentially it's a script that just runs when you do Composer update, and it goes and downloads those 3 files and puts them into your web directory. It does a few others as well, but those are the kind of most significant. So whenever I run the Composer update, I'll get a new version of core, and then I can run install. And I may or may not choose to commit the vendor and the core and the contrib module and contrib theme directories. So yeah, I mentioned earlier the extra things that this template has, the ability to put a link to a patch in the Composer file and have that applied at runtime is quite handy. So I hope that's helped sort of demystify things a little bit. There's still quite a lot to get your head around, I know, but if you kind of want to take one thing away, then I think this idea of one project being Drupal with dependencies and another project being a very small thing with one dependency on Drupal, that for me was the kind of most important sort of discovery that I had to make. Thank you. Yeah, I don't have to be quick on the questions, but yeah. Hi. Yes. Your question?
I've been working with the drupal.org and improving the documentation for Composer.
Right.
Because I tested it and it was a user nightmare. It was user vicious. So we've improved it.
Yeah.
One thing that you latterly mentioned or quickly mentioned, if you run Composer update and don't tell it what to update,
Yes.
so if you put, say, Drupal/webform,
Yeah.
it will go and update everything.
Yeah.
And if you're using Git control, you end up with a huge commit.
Yes.
And it's a real nightmare. And the other thing is that it's the .git ignore doesn't include /vendor as standard, which means that you will start committing your vendor directory.
Yeah.
And if you're going from dev to staging to prod, on the production you really just want to be able to download the composer.json and the .log file, and then run Drupal Composer install.
Yes.
And then it should grab the correct versions. But it doesn't always work.
Yeah, there's a couple of good points there. The first one that I didn't mention is you can run Composer update and you can just give it the name of one package. If you're using the Drupal, the Drupal's bundled Composer JSON, if you're editing that, then definitely you want to be really careful not to do Composer update. And get a global update of everything. You do want to just update a particular module. Yeah, and the thing about running Composer install on the server, if you do run it, then yes, just don't run update on the server, because that could potentially give you a different set of code. Or if unless you actually want to get a new version of any of these libraries, then you'd be fine with just running composer install. Cool.
So I use the composer, I can't remember what it's called, the DrupalProject, the composer nice template, I think is your subdirectory.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what it's called. I think they call it the composer template with the DrupalProject or something like that, but it's the GitHub one.
I've used that fine for fresh builds on 7 and 8 without any issues. Oh no, just 8. Yeah, there's a 7 version, but I haven't used that yet. But for a fresh build, I have no issues with that whatsoever. And everything's super clear. It's when you have an existing site that you might have built with 8 a few months ago that you want to put it in. Would it be a good approach to just go with still a fresh template and just retrofit your Drupal site into that and files, and then Git will just have a panic attack because obviously 20,000 things have changed. But straight after that, it should be sweet, right?
I tested that, it didn't work. I tried moving the core into the web subdirectory, and because I ended up having to edit the composer.json, removing the vendor directory, killing the composer log file, and then running up it, and it was, that was a day of my life I lost.
Here's my advice. Let's only use composer for fresh projects and not for existing ones, and then problem solve.
There is a way you can make it, using the composer Drupal, you can do it that way, but using the composer Drupal project, no. I tried it the other day.
Probably one sort of guiding principle would be to think about what code that you own or you're responsible for. If you go and download Drupal, you're kind of responsible for all of those files. If you pull something in with Composer, you're not responsible. You're almost responsible just for saying this is the version number I want. So when you talk about moving the core directory into a web thing, you're not just moving it. You're kind of relinquishing responsibility of it. So you may decide not to put it in version control at all. You may just let Composer get it, in which case you can just kind of delete it from your repository. But I agree that it's a tricky process, and it's one that catches people out, and it catches a lot of people out because it's easier to start with just downloading tar files, and then suddenly you find you need it halfway down the line.
Two big forks of that Composer template. There's a comments fork that came out of it.
Yeah.
Drupal 8, and that's really nice. It's slightly modified. And then the Amazing.io one.
There's that one. I think Acquia have got their own one as well. So cool. Thanks for that. We got another talk to get in, so probably have to cut it there.